Hi everyone, welcome to the next online talk on my YouTube channel. My name is Caroline Giel and we are talking about culture, society and foreign policy in times of change. Today we are continuing to discuss the role of women, female activism and the role of art in conflicts in Eastern Europe, and we will focus today on Ukraine. The COVID pandemic has a few advantages. You can get to know scholars from all over the world and meet new colleagues. So did I. Jessica Zychowicz is based right now in Canada. I'm based in Germany. Jessica, I'm very happy to meet you and talking to you about your new book.
Great to meet you as well. I see Lesa Ukrainka in the background of your screen, I believe.
Oh, yes, right. I've chosen this picture and yeah, for me, she's very inspiring, a very important person in Ukrainian culture.
Yes, she appears in an image in my book, which I can show you here from a poster campaign created by the artist Oksana Brukovecka. This is my book, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine.
Before we start to talk about your book and about feminism in Ukraine, I would like to introduce you because you're currently based at the University of Alberta and you completed your PhD at the University of Michigan 4 years ago. And the most important, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine, mainly as a Fulbright scholar in 2017 and 2018, researching, teaching at Kiev, which is the most famous university in Ukraine. And we published a numerous amount of articles focusing on gender, on feminism and human rights. And yeah, you just showed us your first book and it was just published some months ago in Toronto University Press. And so Jessica, in writing your book and researching a long time, what and which role are playing women in conflicts, war, revolution in Ukraine, and why it was important for you to analyze the role of women?
So my project began in 2009, before the later, Maidan, Revolution of Dignity, and before the war in Ukraine. However, feminism has been ongoing for over 200 years in Ukraine. The term is interesting to me, and it was very important for me to study the feminists in Ukraine that I encountered in the 2010s, who were reaching out to me and telling me their stories. And I wanted to, by a comparative and ethnographic approach, try to understand something about women's rights as human rights, that the universality of feminism can really be shown in comparing and contrasting and understanding different cultures. So the conflict situation Ukraine is in now today has only made these questions more and more pressing. And my book, now published 10 years later, includes a lot of updates, a lot of more current information, and also shows us the history of the 2000s in where we are today in Ukraine.
We are remembering in these months 7 years of Maidan. Which role played female artists, women, activists during Maidan and aftermath?
Let me show you just a couple of images. So here we have the cover of my book and my website. If anyone would like to contact me, I'm very eager to hear feedback and ideas. But I also want to show an image from the memorials on Maidan that have taken place now. Yes, we are 7 years onward. And the importance of memory of museums in Ukraine. There were installed this particular moment in 2018, several prototypes for the future Maidan Revolution of Dignity Museum, which illustrates to us the importance of the space for art and creative practice in Ukraine as a space of narrative, of coming together in a memorial process 7 years onward that accounts for vastly different experiences, not only of Maidan, but everything before. So this particular image I am showing you from an artist named Vlada Ralko, very talented painter, graphic artist in Ukraine, is called Kievsky Shodenik, Kiev Diary. It includes many, 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 many images, maybe hundreds of her impressions from that particular moment in Ukraine's history.
And you have experienced like Kiev, and you met a lot of female activists the time you lived and taught at Kiev Mohila. And what you think, because you wrote in your book, a sentence, do revolution ever end? Some have written that after any revolution, fatigue sets. But how do we recognize fatigue in this sense? In the years following the Orange Revolution, a range of emotions clustered around the ideals of the Maidan in Ukrainian public discourse. Scholars, journalists, and international commentators in the West tended to note that the ideals of the Maidan had faded. So what did you observe while staying in Kiev?
Yes, so the ideals of the Maidan were cited quite often in the years between the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014. This was a decade, 2004 to 2014. Political commentators in the West, in the United States, where I'm from, and Western Europe were commenting that these ideals had faded or disappeared. I think this is from the level of the state and interstate relations more than people's everyday lives, because what I was observing throughout that time period was quite a bit of enthusiasm and self-organizing among not only women and gender activists, but a lot of others as well. Some of my colleagues also have written about student union groups, for example. Do I agree? So no, I don't agree. I think people's ideals are defined in an ongoing practice of meaning making. And in my book, I'm really documenting meaning making, how this relationship between art, feminism, revolution, or politics is a very fraught relation that involves a lot of official and institutional practices, but those practices where the ideals may be faded because Ukraine kind of fell out of international media in the mid-2000s, they were never faded among people who are living every day and making their lives in Ukraine. These images I show you here from my book really emphasize my ethnographic practice. In writing these stories, I am writing them in a self-reflexive way, but I'm also observing and documenting what I saw on the institutional level. So these were images of the artifacts from the Mezhikirya estate that then ousted President Yanukovych in 2014 had abandoned. And you can see they were installed into the National Museum in Ukraine. And there were writings about this installation. And I'm looking a little bit here in my book, again, at the significance of memory and of a revolutionary process or a regime change, a political upheaval, and what that means in terms of accounting for women. Other ethnographers like Sarah Phillips have written about this. I cite her work quite a bit in mine. In the 1990s, during the political upheaval taking place after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I'm really building also on my predecessors, my feminist predecessors in academia, many of whom in the 90s were coming from the former Eastern European spaces. Elena Gapova from Minsk in Belarus, who set up the East European Feminist Gender Studies program in Exodus in Vilnius, is a good example. She has been influential in my work here. And I wanted to reinvestigate those conversations and conferences that brought together women scholars, East and West, for my generation today, and what we are creating in our own context and across bridges.
Jessica, what are the links to Soviet times when we're talking about feminism in Ukraine?
This image in particular is a book, or part of my book, a whole chapter of my book, deserves a book of its own, by Evgenia Belarusets, who uses the forms of the Soviet era to recreate her own aesthetic. Here, I compare her to documentary photography, like in Alexander Rodchenko and others. So the Soviet significance is really, it's really about intergenerational solidarity in Ukraine, I think, as much as it is in any other society, that the experience of one's grandmother being, completely, or if not all, majority of their lives lived in the Soviet Union, they faced and they pioneered and invented and reinvented questions that are still pertinent today. One of these is the question of the double burden: how much to work outside of the home versus in the domestic sphere, state-supported childcare subsidies, the question of abortion. These are with us again and again in and across societies. And in Ukraine is no different in this case. So the intergenerational solidarity has become more and more acute in Ukraine in the post-Maidan era, with the removal of Lenin monuments, the decommunization laws that were introduced in 2015 in outlawing references, symbolic and actual, to the Soviet past. It has created a very complex situation for not only feminists, but anyone working in the information sphere, which we'll talk about later. And I think that for the particular activists and artists that I'm looking at in my book, I've really tried to survey a generation, but I am very much interested in those who are really reflecting on what can be salvaged from the Soviet experience, not outlawing in the name of, creating an arbitrary censorship law, but in the practices and the processes of documenting. So again, I reflect just briefly on this particular image because the artist was using an ethnographic, and she still is very active. She uses an ethnographic approach to her subjects, writing about them, interviewing them, forming relationships over several years before photographing them. And this particular approach was also, used by artists in the Soviet period, many of whom were killed, for documenting things like homelessness and any references to Ukrainian nationhood. So the relations between politics and art are also at the center of my book. I'm asking a lot of questions about power and about the body, what women, not only women, but also LGBT activists and others can reclaim or express, is quite revelatory for everyone, not only gender minorities.
You also concentrated on East and West cultural stereotypes. What you would answer, what are the differences in feminism and feminist activism, East and West?
Yes, so the construction of East and West is always changing and invented. The scholar Larry Wolff, historian who wrote Inventing Eastern Europe, is a great reference for this particular discussion. And in my book, I'm looking a little bit at stereotypes in chapters 1 and 2, in particular around sex work in Ukraine. And I'm thinking through the debates. I'm showing, the stereotype, deconstructing it through a wider debate that includes serious questions about policies that impact people's everyday lives. I think that this is something we have in common in the East and the West, that we are always faced with stereotypes of femininity that oppress us, whether in media or in labor and hiring and other forms of discrimination that maybe prevent women from taking on leadership roles. Recent studies have shown in Ukraine, there is about a 25% representation rate in the parliament. There are very few Ukrainian women in business and in academia. 5 years ago, the scholar Tamara Martinyuk showed that in the National Academy of Sciences, there were, I believe, less than 10 female academics represented on the entire board, which includes over 100 members. So there are serious issues to be tackled. And if we are speaking also about my own country, the United States, you can see that our battles are very real as well. And in my book, I'm thinking quite historically about the 20th century. The title of my book includes Superfluous Women in the 21st Century. But to really understand our position, I'm also thinking about the organizations that were set up after 1970, when feminists really around the world organized through the auspices of the UN. And even before that, going back to the first wave, the March 8th holiday and International Women's Day and the suffragists, these are areas that I think the East and the West together we are uncovering again.
Do you have some pictures illustrating this in your book?
In my book, I have a lot of pictures, 68 total. Many are published for the first time. They're on permission from the artists who created them. Let's see, why don't I turn to one of the paintings? I'm going to show you this.
I will combine it with my next question. What is about international and women solidarity? We know all the pictures from Femin.
Yep.
But how how you would describe this solidarity? What you observed?
So there are many levels and sectors of society that could be mentioned or discussed. I'm looking quite narrowly, I guess, at the creative sector, at the production of ideas, really, that is happening not only in the arts, but also in institutions and among intellectuals in Ukraine. Very few have written intellectual histories of Ukraine in the 20th and 21st century, and I think it's important always to put women at the center of intellectual histories, because it's so often that women are excised from the history of ideas. Here is a painting by the artist Lesia Homenko, who is a co-founder of the Revolutionary Experimental Space Group, which was very active in the 2000s. Now they have their own, careers, doing solo careers. But I would say in terms of solidarity, you also have the sector of society working with NGOs and international programs like Helsinki Union or Amnesty International, which has now added gender issues to its portfolio. So has Human Rights Watch. And UNICEF and UN Women are working in Ukraine. So you've got several layers on which solidarity can be built, and oftentimes creative production and intellectuals have to make decisions about how involved to be or not involved to be in politics and the role of an artist or the role of an intellectual within society is a question I'm exploring in my book, and it's a very old one. I think it's a very old one. Can you
show us some more pictures from your book?
Sure. I discuss a lot of digital media and the role of 1970s media activist techniques that were being used by the controversial women's group Femin, which kind of brought Ukraine into the media.
I think you have some of them in your presentation.
These are examples from my own photography of my observations in 2018 at the Women's March and the Kiev Pride March. And these are in counter to the earlier discussions in my book about the feminine images in the mass media, because you could see here the role of the drone in both of these images. Digital media and technologies of the internet have become more and more important in the last 20 years, and if not, have completely replaced the street as a place of protest and expression of political ideas. I think that this has now, in our moment of the rise of the far right, has a lot of risks that are carried with it, as well as challenges for activists and artists and also researchers working on these questions. There were a lot of challenges in writing my book, in particular involving information, disinformation, which we will talk about in a minute. But I have some images also in the print copy here, which I should mention there's an e-copy of the book too, and all of the sources are hyperlinked and the images are in color. The print copy is not in color. This is one of the drawbacks of academic publishing, unfortunately, but maybe there will be future editions. Here is a very powerful media image of a sex worker from Ukraine. This doesn't quite do it complete justice, but you can see she is very emaciated and not in good health at all. And this was a photo that became the World Press Prize winner in 2012. And it is a photo that was staged by the wife of Viktor Pinchuk, the oligarch who owns Pinchuk Art Center. She has an NGO that approaches ideas around HIV/AIDS assistance and sex work in Ukraine. But what is fascinating is that this image came 1 year after the feminine image showing one of the feminine group founders, Inna Shevchenko, in Kiev, standing proudly in a protest stance. And I'm not incriminating or condemning either image. I'm showing how the media seizes upon what it wants to see, and the optics of the protest aesthetics coming from Ukraine, they complicate our vision of East-West and our horizons for feminist solidarity. There have been publications such as Oksana Brukovetska's work, What in Me is Feminine, in which she is offering a wider lens, panorama of protest actions in Ukraine that goes well beyond what the World Press photo is showing us, with the juxtaposition of these two images of women in Ukraine, that there's a lot yet to be written. This is only the beginning. This book is just the beginning.
Jessica, if you want, you could close the presentation now, because I would like to ask the almost last question. What's the difference in perception and analysis, Europe versus the US on Eastern Europe, mainly Ukraine?
Yes. Well, it's a very powerful question, because the US and Russia and Germany and Russia have very different relations, but sometimes there are parallels between them. And you can see in this image here from the Women's March in Washington, DC on January 8th in 2017, kind of tongue-in-cheek example of the iconic image of the kiss. And what we can pull out of this maybe is that Ukraine is really important on its own terms, that we always make, it tends to be often that one cannot understand or study Ukraine without comparing it to what is happening in Russia or to relations with Putin and his presidency. But what I've done in my book is I've taken words of activists on their own terms without trying to apply a United States-Russian relations kind of parameter. I'm departing a lot from political science, although I rely on work by Lucan Wei, for example, who's writing about the stability of authoritarianism in Ukraine through all revolutions that have happened in Ukraine. There's still very strong sort of oligarchic root there that is similar perhaps to Russia, but I don't make those parallels so clear because I want to show that the East-West dichotomies of the Cold War era that have become so rooted, for example, in the American imagination of Ukraine are not what they seem, that we are a generation on and the new generations in Ukraine have extensive experience in the former West, traveling, speaking Western European languages and very fluent English oftentimes as well. So I hope that I will have an opportunity to travel to Berlin someday in the context of feminist discussions about this, because Germany and the Scandinavian countries are very important to first wave feminism and the suffragists in the March 8th demonstrations from the American history of feminism as well. So our
it
country.
Would be a pleasure to meet you in Berlin. And at the very end, how we can support women in Ukraine. The COVID pandemic is very serious right now in Ukraine, and what you would suggest.
So there's a lot. There are a lot of
post the presentation.
Sure, that's great. There are a lot of organizations working in Ukraine, and I think there are also a lot of grassroots ways to give directly. Social media, the internet has afforded us the ability to give through microcredit or to support artists. In my work, it's always been important to me to give back. So I volunteer as a translator. I'm working as a curator. I'm doing projects with Ukrainian authors and artists all the time, and I've co-researched this book quite a bit with many of them. And that's why I dedicate the book to artists and intellectuals and scholars living in Ukraine and in Poland today, because I have really done a lot with them. And to help Ukrainians on a pragmatic level is one thing, but there's also a solidarity that is deeper and lasting, and it involves staying with the questions that are hard to ask and not turning away when feminism becomes not welcome in the media, when it's not being published on, when you have to really carve out a place to speak, then you probably are saying something important, because you are the platform. When you are a woman and you are in the public sphere, you've already won just by getting there. So help Ukrainians find those voices, those platforms. What you're doing today with this YouTube channel is a great example. I think we can seize upon the media mechanisms right now in order to amplify struggles that are very real and people are paying for with their lives. So thank you again.
Jessica Zychowicz, thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you about feminism and artists, activists in Ukraine. Thank you so much once again, and hope to see you in Berlin. And all of you, if you're interested in further online talks, so just click the button and you will be informed. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye.
Thank you.